Welcome to this evening's debate. I'm Mark Galloway. I'm the director of IBT, the International Broadcasting Trust, and we're an educational media charity involved in a range of activities to do with promoting good quality media coverage of the developing world. And we work with broadcasters and NGOs, so today's subject is very much close to my heart. The first thing I wanted to do is just try and get a sense of who's in the audience, because I know we have an audience with lots of experience, journalists and people from aid agencies. So can we just see, if you put your hands up if you're a journalist. Okay, that's about a quarter of the room. Put your hands up if you work for an aid agency. Okay, a few more. A third of the room. Excellent. Okay, and the others interested? Members of the public, members of the Frontline Club. Tonight's debate is going to be quite informal and interactive. We have a blogger, and there is a hashtag, which is Frontline Club. So please think about questions you want to ask or statements. But first of all, we're going to hear from our four speakers. The first speaker on my right is Fran Unsworth, who's been head of BBC News Gathering for the last 5 years. And Fran has worked for the BBC for all of her journalistic career. She's worked in local radio, for Radio 1, for Radio 4. She's been in Washington, and she spent some time in Westminster. So how does this issue of the media getting on with NGOs work from your point of view?
Well, I would have to say, actually, on the whole, pretty well. We have our ups and downs. They have their criticisms of us. But actually, I have quite a good relationship with particularly the Disasters Emergency Committee. Because we need each other. You know, it's not bad, really.
Okay, well, let's actually get a sense of what the audience thinks. If you think, for those who are journalists and NGOs, that you have a good working relationship, put your hands up. Oh, not many, not many. So I think there'll be some questions for you, Fran, later, perhaps. And hands up if you think it's a relationship where there's room for improvement. Okay, interesting. Well, let's try and make tonight's discussion quite concrete and talk about real examples where things aren't working and where they could work better. So I'd now like to ask Andrew Hogg from Christian Aid to speak. Andrew is also a veteran journalist who's worked at the Sunday Times and the Observer and was head of the Insight team at the Sunday Times, and he's also been based in Africa as a correspondent. So do things look good from where you sit?
I think Fran basically put her finger on it, that we, in a sense, we're locked into a relationship, NGOs and the media, whether we like it or not. The NGOs need the media. We need it to highlight the issues that we're concerned about. We need it to show the world at large what we're doing, not least our supporters who want to hear our voice. And of course we need the media to help us raise money when the emergencies strike. And you know, we're all familiar with the DEC appeals which go out at that particular time. I think it's something of an exaggeration to say that the media actually needs NGOs. They certainly seek our help at times of emergency. They want the footage of the planes being loaded with supplies. They want the words with the people in country. Someone like Christian Aid, the agency I work for, we've got partners in nearly 50 countries. They're the poorest countries, tend to be the poorest countries around the globe, which tend to be the places, not exclusively, but in many cases where disaster does strike. So they want our views. They want to hear the stories of the people that we're dealing with. And also, given the various specialisms that the NGO world is engaged in, they also want the stories that we produce ourselves, the expert reports, the new insights into global problems. I think given the fact that this relationship exists, for it to remain healthy and functioning like any other relationship, it involves mutual responsibilities. The responsibility of the NGO sector, as Mark outlined, I'm a former journalist of a number of years standing, a Middle East correspondent, Africa correspondent, and insight editor at the Sunday Times, to name but three of the roles that I held. And what I have endeavoured to do with whichever NGO I'm working for is to ensure that the response to media inquiries is both prompt and professional and as transparent as the circumstances warrant. We have to be careful that the zeal of some NGO workers doesn't lead us into making misleading or exaggerated claims. Fundamentally, what we produce that we hope the media will give space to has to be interesting. It has to be newsworthy. Now, the goalposts have shifted slightly in the recent past. The Guardian, for instance, has a website now purely devoted to development stories. Now, I'm not suggesting that they are not interesting stories, the stories they cover, but in many cases they are providing an outlet and giving a voice to NGOs which would otherwise not be heard. The BBC also, to some extent, does this as well, particularly through BBC Online. So if we've got those responsibilities upon us, then I think the media also has responsibilities to us. And that is that they have to report what we do in a fair manner. They're not under any obligation to report what we do in a fair manner, but one would hope that fairness would predominate. If I could go back to this question of what it's like to work for a development agency trying to get media coverage. We have got an internal communications newsletter that goes out once a day, and this was given quite a lot of prominence a couple of days ago. Christian aid partner Association Building Communities has reached an important victory to protect the livelihoods and the lands of 2,000 agro-pastoralists families in southwest Angola. 1 year ago, the provincial government of Hula started to develop a project that would prevent the traditional pastoralists from using an area in the Gambos municipalities to feed their cattle in times of drought. The communities, with the support of the organisation backed by Christian Aid, reacted and developed an advocacy strategy to challenge the plan, which consisted of petitions, meetings and audiences. It's all extremely worthy. It is the bread and butter of what Christian Aid as a development agency does, but it's not exactly earth-shattering, even though it talks to some fundamentally important themes: securing livelihoods, drought, which may be the result of climate change, and supporting vulnerable communities. I think most people in this room would recognise that these are worthwhile things to be doing, but these are not things that we would expect the mass media to actually pick up and take much of an interest in, unless we had the services of a top-rate photographer who was able, at our behest, to go and take pictures of these pastoralists and then to offer these as galleries to the various websites, national newspaper websites, broadcast media websites that exist now. Or unless we wanted to highlight this as an example of climate change in Africa and a journalist happened to be writing about that particular issue at a time, they might use this as an illustration. I could go on endlessly in a similar vein about all kinds of disaster risk reduction programs we have that enable 2 small villages in Honduras to continue sending their kids to school when flooding down a deep gorge up until very recently had made that an impossibility. So when we do try to make our work interesting, we are looking at trying to maximise the picture, if you like. So Christian Aid at the moment is running a very big tax campaign where we're pointing out the cost of tax abuse to developing countries. We have estimated it runs into the region of about $160 billion a year, which is 1.5 times the size of the aid budget given by rich countries to poor. And this is largely the result of companies trading internationally, depressing the profits that they make in poorer countries to avoid paying tax there, moving the money offshore into tax havens where they don't pay tax. Now that is a campaign which has been not the easiest to sell, not least because a number of media outlets in this country make full use of tax havens themselves. But nonetheless, it is picking up a degree of traction. Even to my surprise, just before Christmas, the Financial Times ran an editorial which seemed to support one of our major asks, which was that companies trading internationally should report the profits made and the taxes paid in every country where they're working. That's just one illustration of how we are trying to bring the plight of poorer countries to the attention of the public at large and trying to influence behaviour thereafter. If you look at the media, and as I said earlier, one would expect a fair run from them, and by and large we do get it, but there is a mood out there. It's a mood that has been voiced on a couple of occasions with regard to Haiti. That mood is effectively that aid agencies are quite happy to collect your money, but they're failing to deliver the goods on the ground. And we heard a documentary from Ed Sturton on BBC Radio a couple of weeks ago in which he basically catalogued the failings of the aid agencies in Haiti. I personally didn't object to the content of the programme because everything that he outlined was true. There were major problems there that we were aware of, that we are endeavouring to combat ourselves. My only disappointment with the programme was it only presented one side of the story. But then this goes back to the issue of what's interesting and what's not. Because one of the biggest problems in Haiti at the moment is trying to prove who owns the land. Only 5% of land there is registered. The whole question of land tenure is deeply, deeply complicated, and it is one of the things hindering reconstruction. And so when the phone went a few weeks ago and it was the Times saying, can you write us 400 words on the cholera epidemic in Haiti, why it should break out now, is it the aid agencies to blame? I put the issue of land tenure in the piece, and when they had subbed it and sent it back to me for approval, that was the one blinking thing they'd missed out, because they said, oh, it's too boring, it's too complicated. And I said it's absolutely fundamental to trying to understand what's going on there. Unfortunately, I was able to get them to put it back in. This isn't an anti-BBC jibe. Basically, I've been in a position as a journalist and done exactly the same as Ed Sturton did. You get parachuted in somewhere, you've got to get a story, you look around, you go, my goodness me, this isn't quite what it's supposed to be, is it? Let's write that up. Where I do take issue, and where I did take issue, was with the BBC World Service programme about aid to Ethiopia, in which, although they have fought and claimed that if you looked at the programme word by word, it was absolutely accurate, it nonetheless created the deeply unfortunate impression that 90% of all aid given to Ethiopia in 1985 under the Live Aid, Band Aid banner, as well as Christian Aid banner and all the other agencies working there, ended up in the hands of rebels to buy arms. To me, that programme should not have been broadcast. It was, if it was going, and what I would say is it was absolutely right that questions should be asked about where aid money goes. I'm not saying we should be impervious to scrutiny, far from it. Charities in this country are huge. There's a $52 billion budget. There's over 250,000 of them, and they employ somewhere in the region of 3 million people, employ or take on board as volunteers. Yet we deserve proper scrutiny. All I'm simply asking for is that when being scrutinised, broadcasters and the media at large recognise the impact that negative sentiments can have on giving and helping those people who we are trying to help. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Our next speaker hasn't worked for an aid agency and doesn't work for a broadcaster. Mike Green was Director of Communications at DFID, so you, to some extent, have observed this relationship. You're now a writer, and For those who are interested, Mike's books include Philanthrocapitalism.
Well done.
And ironically, The Road from Ruin, How to Revive Capitalism and Put America Back on Top. So maybe we're going to get a slightly more scurrilous perspective from you. What's your take on this relationship?
Thanks, Mark. I'm here tonight because I think, like many of you, hopefully all of you, I care passionately about the assault we're making on global poverty. But I'm also here because I'm deeply, deeply worried. We have a government that is exceptionally progressive on aid, given its commitments to increase the UK aid budget to 0.7% of national income within the next few years, despite the fact that economic growth seems to be rather passé at the moment. And that's on the back of a previous government that demonstrated a real commitment to aid. And I'm worried because our politicians are so far ahead of public opinion. I should say that I joined DFID actually as an economist, so I worked on development programs for a long time and then went to the communications job, so I've done the development thing. But I went to the Eurobarometer website today, and they did a poll last year of all the EU countries on the public's attitudes towards development. And I'm pleased to report that 91% of Britons said it's important to help developing countries. Which is not bad, but not surprising, because you have to be a bit of a callous bastard to say no. But what's interesting about that figure is that it's exactly the same as the EU average. So it's nowhere above the norm for other countries. And actually some of the East European countries have much lower scores. So in terms of broad support for development, the UK is not exceptional, and we're behind countries like Sweden, which have had a long commitment to aid. I then popped over to the DFID website, where there's some opinion polling data from February of last year. And that was quite striking, because since 2007, there's been this opinion polling on attitudes to aid. And in September 2007, 50% of British respondents said the government should give more aid. By February 2010, that had fallen to 35%. So that's a one-third reduction. We'd also seen that the number of people who disagree with increasing aid had gone up from 16% to 29%, nearly doubled. We also see that people who say corruption makes it not worth giving had gone up from 44% to 57%. Now, I think this 2010 figure is the first time we've seen such a serious downturn in public support for aid. So I think we've actually got a crisis coming, a crisis of confidence in the whole aid business. Now, in some ways, it's going to be government that's going to bear the brunt. Because actually, if you ask most of those people who are polled in that survey, they actually aren't thinking about government. There's a question which says, who does aid in that survey? Any guesses on who comes out top?
United Nations.
OK, not Bob Galloway, it was organisations, but Bob probably would come out high. United Nations came out at 12%. I would like to congratulate Christian Aid because they came out at 13%. So Christian Aid is more important than the UN.
Good.
But sadly, Christian Aid is nowhere near the top scorer, which was Oxfam, 36%. So still some work to do, Andrew. At the bottom of the list was the Department for International Development, which came out at 2%. Now, that's a bit unfair because, of course, a couple of years ago there was a major rebranding exercise to rebrand DFID's aid as UK aid. And I'm pleased to report that UK aid has got as high as 2% as well. I mean, I made this point just because I think there's often a perception in Britain that somehow public opinion is really progressive on this, we really support it. When actually what we've really had in Britain, and maybe I exaggerate a little here, is a benign conspiracy amongst the elite, amongst the aid lobby and our politicians, to have pushed all this resource into aid way ahead of where the public is. And so I think there's a danger of an aid crisis coming. And I don't think public opinion is well informed to actually debate the choices that we have ahead. And that's why I'm worried. And I think part of the problem is, exactly as Andrew said, these things are complex issues. How do you engage the public on them? The way people normally engage is through humanitarian emergencies. And the great thing about humanitarian emergencies is often there's something you can do, yeah? Because it's not about an abstract questions of governance or health systems. It's about things you can do and has an emotional appeal. And that's great, but I do wonder, what effect that has on our understanding. Whether that really penetrates through to any deeper understanding of the development issues. So I think that's what a problem. I think another problem we have is actually the NGOs themselves. I was constantly frustrated in my job at the kind of policy campaigns and lobbying the NGOs were doing. I haven't looked at the tax campaign, but certainly some of the campaigns around trade and other issues I thought were deeply dishonest. And I must give a shout out actually to Claire Short, who when she was Secretary of State for International Development, I think showed exceptional courage in resisting very strong NGO lobbies that were trying to push her to a very hostile attitude towards trade and towards business. And I think the NGOs are starting to get the importance around trade, investment, business in developing countries, but still have quite some way to go. And I think we've seen that in some ways in the reporting last week on some of the issues around microfinance, which I'm happy to talk about a bit later. So I think there are serious challenges, serious issues to be debated, and I worry that the NGOs are not actually doing a good job in really building awareness. But I suppose I'm not worried, because I also think the NGOs are starting to be disintermediated. I'm very excited about some of these new online giving platforms like Kiva.org. That started 5 years ago in a garage somewhere in California. It's now turned over more than $100 million in microfinance loans. They're heading towards $1 billion in the next few years. They've got thousands of members around the globe. And the great thing about Kiva is it gives people a chance to participate. They can see who their money is being lent to. And what's really interesting about Kiva is they're starting to take that initial engagement to then build a support base. And they want to start becoming a lobbying organisation for the poor. So they want to start using flash emails to get people to lobby for key legislation in Congress, for example. So I think some of these online giving platforms offer a much richer experience for the public. They give them a chance to engage and participate. And in engaging and participating, they get to learn a lot more about the issues and become more engaged in actually the problems themselves. So I'm kind of worried, but I do have some optimism.
Okay, thanks. I'm sure there's at least one remark there that will be picked up by the audience. Let's hear from Ben and then we'll come to the audience. So Ben is, you make radio documentaries and you're also a photo film producer, which is a new term for me. So you produce content and you work with NGOs, so you're also mediating those relationships.
Yeah, my background was as a documentaries producer, mainly at Radio 4, and now I have a company called Duck Rabbit, which I set up 3 years ago after coming back from Kenya following the humanitarian crisis there where I was working. And we do produce radio documentaries and photo films, which is essentially films where documentary audio and still images are combined together. I just want to start by asking a question because I want to find out how many people in the audience I'm going to piss off tonight. So how many people thought the BBC was wrong to not, the word ban is incorrect, but not to play the Gaza appeal for funding? Wrong. How many people thought they were wrong? Okay, so only about half the people in this room I'm going to piss off, which is good. And the nice thing I noticed, the 2 people in this room who've employed me so far this year didn't put their hands up. So, as I say, I'm talking tonight as a practitioner. I'm really interested in how the NGO world may affect the world of journalism, because I totally agree with what you're saying. What's really important is the debate and the conversation about the developing world, about economic systems, about justice, and that's much more important in many ways than giving, because the systems need to change, and that's only going to happen through conversation. As I say, I've got 2 people in this room here who have employed me this year. One is an NGO, and we did work for them that about 300,000 people saw. It's really work I'm very, very proud of in the Congo. And the other one is a broadcaster, and if you go to the World Service website, their documentaries get 1.6 million downloads every day. Yeah. Now, it's protecting those people and the stories that they tell, which are going to inform and educate people all around the world about what's going on, that is very, very important to me. So I'm just going to show a quick film which went up live last week and was attached to a documentary produced for the World Service in a series that's on at the moment. The last one goes out tomorrow. It's called Open Eye, and this one is it's a post-humanitarian situation, but it's about conflict, about the civil war in Lebanon.
It was everything, you just name it. Kidnapping people, shelling civilian quarters, bombs, torturing, electrical shocks, killing in the streets or killing in prisons or things like that, everything. And I did not think that what I was doing was bad. There was a period that I think that if I had died then, I would have gone directly to hell.
When they took my boys, there was an Israeli invasion. The refugee camp was being bombed. There were more than 200 militants, tanks, trucks, soldiers, Israeli army, phalangists, and the South Lebanon army. They were all there. They came in the house and asked, "What's your religion?" Palestinian. Then a militant told my children one by one to stand up. Stand up, stand up, stand up. Then they took my 4 children. They put them in the truck. They started going around, getting 2 from here and 2, 3, 4, 5 from there, until they had filled the 2 trucks with men. They took one of my sons before he was dressed. He was in his pajamas, so I took his shirt. The militant got on the truck and kicked my son and hit him on his mouth. He put up his hand to protect himself. The militant kicked him again and hit him in his stomach. He pushed him off the truck and they started kicking him and beating him.
If some Christians were kidnapped by the Muslim side, immediately the same day, the same amount more or less was kidnapped, and they waited to make an exchange. And if these were killed, by reaction the others were killed. Those who had been kidnapped.
If I only knew that my sons were going and I would not see them again, what would my life be for? I would have thrown myself under the wheels of the truck that took my sons. I would have let the trucks drive over me and kill me and not survive them. What do I want with my life after my sons?
So you were behind some executions?
Yes, but it was individual executions.
Were the bodies sent to their parents?
Never. The parents didn't even know maybe that he was in our custody. No, the parents never knew, I think.
What happened to the bodies?
The whole Lebanese soil is planted with mass graves. So that's the case, I think. I know about one mass grave only. The others I don't know. I really don't know.
And what about the mothers?
I don't have an answer. I'm sorry, but I don't have an answer.
I want my sons, even if it's one bone from them. I want it back, to put it in a frame and keep it here with me. A shoe from my sons, from one of them. I want it for me. I want them even if they're only remains. They are my sons. And if they're not alive, I want to know why they were killed. Starting on the 17th of September 1982, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday and Saturday. In those 4 days, they took away 2,111 men and boys. No one came back. It's enough.
make 3 very, very quick points off the back of that film, which are very relevant to the aid debate. One is budgets. Budgets are being cut all the time. I left the BBC because I was fed up as a radio producer of seeing people who were 21, 22, brought in as something called assistant producers, making radio programmes with half the time that I did when I joined the BBC, and they were poor. A lot of the quality, really, we saw that go down. What happens then if you're working in humanitarian storytelling? There's a danger then you're going to start relying too much on the aid agencies, and that's already starting to happen. We're seeing photographic galleries on the BBC where the byline is not the photographer but is the aid agency. You know, I saw one the other week from Sudan and it was Save the Children. Can you imagine if in the UK elections the byline on the photography was Oxfam? Would we stand for that? Why is it different when we go to Sudan? This is really fundamentally important. The second thing goes back to independent and balance. If I rely as a programme maker on the NGOs, if I rely on Amnesty and the Red Cross who assisted making this programme, then how is my independence compromised? Because on the one level the story is we must dig up these graves. But on the other level, the balancing story is if we dig up these graves, more mass graves might come about in Lebanon. There was fighting on the streets last night. It's kicking off again. Balance is fundamentally important, and if we start to lose that because the NGOs have too much of a grip on the media, then we've got a big problem because we can't have that debate that's so important. And the third point is about transparency and governance. One of the most fundamental things that NGOs go on about is transparency and governance. One of the most fundamental pillars in terms of transparency and governance is the media. Okay, we've got a significant problem. If you think about what the function of something like the BBC is it to ask people to put money in their pockets and give money to aid? Very, very important. Or is it to inform and educate you about what is actually going on? After the tsunami, we gave too much money. Too much money. MSF were the only organisation who said stop giving money. Can the BBC keep playing appeals for money? Well, the actual story is, hang on a minute, these people are self-sufficient. They will find ways to mend their own communities. Oxfam can't do that. They've never been there. The infrastructure isn't in place. So that's why there needs to be this fundamental separation. My concern is that we're starting to see it erode. And I can say that as somebody who works in both camps. Although when I work for NGOs, we always apply the same principles we do as we work at the BBC, and we won't compromise on that because we feel that good storytelling, wherever it comes from, will be appreciated.
Okay, thanks, Ben. I'd like to pick up one of the issues that Andrew raised, which I think goes to the nub of the matter. Aid agencies deal with complex issues. It's hard for the media, especially popular mainstream media. And the reality is that for most people in the UK, the BBC and mainstream television news is where they get their information about development and what's happening in the developing world. And Andrew, you made the point that the British public actually doesn't really get development. Do you think the BBC is rising to this challenge of communicating serious, important but difficult, complex issues to your audiences?
Well, there's so many interesting points which have been made. It's sort of impossible to answer them all. It's a fascinating debate. The BBC takes £3.2 billion of money from the licence payer. So in order to live up to its very privileged position in getting this public money, it has a duty to give its audiences the information that they need to live their lives. So I would hope that they do attempt to live up to their responsibilities as far as telling the complex stories around this area are concerned. However, let's remember who pays for the BBC, and it is the licence payer. It isn't actually the Foreign Office anymore because they've announced that they're going to withdraw their funding. It's the licence payer. So I'll give you some figures about some audience research that we have recently done amongst our licence payers, and it shows that 10% of our audiences are interested in foreign news, and they have a hard interest in foreign news. 38% of our audience have a bit of an interest in foreign news. And what they are particularly interested in are the big stories, that 38%. The other 10% are the sort of, I think that what you'd probably characterise them as the Radio 4 audience, really. That's probably who they are, truthfully. And they are interested in foreign affairs in general, and they're interested in that kind of issue that you've just raised. Now, of course, the BBC, because of its responsibilities, it has to be, you know, audience responsive, but not audience led. That's not what we're about in BBC News. So we do have to tell our audiences about the world around them in all its complexities, even if they're not always interested. And our challenge is to make it interesting for them, and to find ways of telling these stories, and to find ways of making these stories interesting and where they can connect to them. So we do try, I think, pretty hard to do that quite often. We don't always succeed, obviously, but we do try. But the 10 o'clock news is 28 minutes long. It contains 8 packages a night. So these stories have to take their place in that agenda. And if I could tell you the numbers of times when I've sat on platforms with specialist interest groups who say to me, why don't you do more religion? Why don't you do more arts? Why don't you do more foreign affairs? Why don't you do more stories about development? I have to say to them, you know, unfortunately, the 10 o'clock news stubbornly refuses to extend itself beyond that 28 minutes. And we have to actually find time for these stories alongside all these other things that the British public need in order to live their lives. Having said all that, where there is a key story such as Haiti or Pakistan, it becomes much easier to hook these really complex issues onto that big news story. And this is where you can bring your audience in to tell them stories about the complexities which surround this stuff. There are strong pictures there, which is obviously a huge help in television news. You have to have strong pictures. But we do try our utmost to actually not necessarily just tell those stories in that arena, but actually get away from that. For instance, global food prices. We did 8 minutes recently, leading the 10 o'clock news, looking at global food prices and the impact that and we did a bounce all around the world with our foreign correspondents who tried to tell that story in all its complexities. So there are significant efforts made, but we are not going to probably deliver what I suspect a lot of people in this room want us to deliver because of the constraints that are placed on us by delivering to our audiences. So I think that what I would sort of say is that where I started from is that, you know, I think our relationship with the aid agencies is pretty good because actually I find that broadly they understand this. I mean, that's what you've said on this platform from people here, that they know understand what television news is about. And when I meet the aid agencies and meet the Disasters Emergencies Committee, they do have an understanding about all this stuff. But we do have different interests here. You know, our job is to, as I say, tell the audience the things that we think that they need to know, and the job of the aid agencies is to raise as much money as they can for whatever cause it is that they have got going. And sometimes those interests aren't always the same.
Okay, well, let's hear from you. And we started off when we had a show of hands with quite a number of people saying there is a problem. So let's try and see what the problem is. So anyone who put their hand up who wants to say from their perspective what the problem is. Let's just take a few comments, questions, statements. And can you say who you are and where you're from, if you're from somewhere?
My name's Kitty Logan. I'm a freelance journalist, but I do a lot of work for aid agencies and the UN. This isn't really criticism, it's more constructive suggestions, practical suggestions. I've got a job to do and I'd like to do it better for myself and for everybody that I work with. I think there are several points I'd like to raise. Top of my list, just because it came up recently, is cooperation. I feel that working in the field with many of these aid agencies and trying to on-pass those stories to TV news, is that there could be more made out of shared resources and thinking together about one story and one message that we're trying to get across. Recent example, I was offered an opportunity to go on a free trip to Kenya by the Gavi Alliance, which deals with global vaccinations, and they wanted me to cover a launch of their new pneumonia vaccine, which was going to save the lives of millions of children worldwide. And as you know, BBC 10 o'clock news ran that story last night with the cooperation of Save the Children, as did Sky News and ITN. Now, when I went to pitch that story, everybody laughed at me and said, well, we're doing that on the 24th of January. February 14th, which is when I was offered to go on the trip, was too late. Now, I went back to the Gavi Alliance and I said, well, why didn't we think of this before and combine these two events into one story, the launch of the new vaccine with the Save the Children story, and just have it bang out there on one day? Because as far as I'm concerned, the horse has already run out of the stable door. There's no point in doing the story again on the 14th. It's very hard for me to sell that. In practical terms, there are many instances where I've been in countries and NGOs have approached me and said, oh, you're already in Ethiopia, can you do a quick story for us? And the NGO that's hired me, or the TV news organisation that's hired me, said, well, no, you're on a contract for us, we've paid for you, you can't. And I really believe there could be more made out of that. And what I try to do in practical terms is now, if I have the resources, to fly myself out there independently and say, here I am, and everybody runs to me and says, great, you know, we've got somebody on the ground. But I really think that sometimes there's a sense of competition between the NGOs and the news networks, where we're all actually trying to say the same thing about the same story. We're kind of in competition with each other when we shouldn't be, and there could be more made out of sharing resources on the ground.
Okay, thanks, Kitty. Anyone else on the problem here at the front?
Hi, my name's Stephen Sidlow. I work at Demotics. It's a photo agency, news agency. We work a hell of a lot with NGOs and aid organisations, providing with a voice to actors that are on the ground. We bridge a gap between media and aid organisations. There's a huge area where there's been missed out here. It's basically that the amount of foreign news correspondents that have lost their jobs, so forth, that there's a gap that needs to be filled. There seems to be an awful rush now to fill this gap with content. I had a conversation with someone from the BBC with the online send us your images department, and their question to me was, how do you verify most of your images that we get? And the thing is, they get sent in single images, 1,000 single images on snowmen to everything else. The thing is that, well, I'm trying to say that aid organisations need to work to find a model with photojournalists, freelance photojournalists that are working in the field, but at the same time, you still cannot parachute in photojournalists to do the work for them. There has to be a model of learning and development, so they can do the actual stories for themselves, providing people with a voice, providing people with the ability to tell stories on the ground there. And I think that a model that can go right through for media organisations to NGOs definitely needs to be bashed out.
Great, thanks. There was a question here in the front row.
Frank Jackson, World Disarmament Campaign. There are so many issues here that it's very difficult to know just where to start. But generally speaking, I'm not so much concerned with the media as with the actual situation in the world and what we can do to change it, because clearly I would say that the most general thing one can say is that what is lacking in the world is justice. If we had a just world system, then a great many of these problems would disappear, and a lot of the work of the aid agencies would be unnecessary. For example, the EU constitution refers to free and fair trade, as if they were synonymous.
Let's focus on the subject. Have you got something to say on the media relationship with aid agencies? Because there are lots of idealists in this room, but we're not on that subject tonight.
Well, let me just say one thing then. I mentioned the World Disarmament Campaign. The world is awash with more weapons of all kinds than ever in history, and they are produced by the mostly produced by the five permanent members of the Security Council, whose job is supposed to be to promote peace and security. And I think the media ought to publicise that fact much more than they do.
Okay, excellent point. Yeah, here.
Hi, my name's Mary Holmes, and I'm just speaking as as an individual, but I'm on a management committee of a charity. I mean, I'd rather agree with the previous speaker about some of the problems, and one of my constructive points, though, would be to say, couldn't people try and cover more complicated stories? I mean, if you take Haiti, it is in the news, and we should be asking, why has Haiti's environment got so poor? What happened to their trade? I mean, I'm not saying you can solve all the problems, but I think actually when I talk to people, they may not agree with me on lots of things, but they are interested in things. And after these programs that you have, or you have your small packages about aid and things on the news, people say, why don't these people have any loons? Why are children playing in the dirt, etc.? A lot of people, so I would argue for, okay, you can't put it in the news, but more complicated stories which look at more complicated issues. And I thought some programs that were very good were when they took teenagers to work in sweatshops. Now, I know you don't always want to have a British celebrity or British connection, but that is a really good way, I think, of getting it home to people, those kind of things. So I'd argue for dealing with complex issues in some programs, and also trying to get, people love soaps, trying to get more a soap type of thing, so you've got ongoing stories.
Okay, anyone else? Yeah, right at the back, please. Then
Hi, my name's Andrew Lauder. I'm an independent researcher and writer on humanitarian affairs. So what we found is that there is a sort of unhealthy relationship between the media and aid agencies. And it goes something like this. Within aid agencies, there are these media and fundraising, media departments who are very strong on image promotion and fundraising. And they essentially have more power than before within aid agencies. And what they do is that they try very hard to they have an overbearing influence on aid programs, and that means that aid programs end up working to be seen to be doing good rather than actually doing good. Okay, so that's a big problem.
Okay, well, there's people in the audience who are going to answer that point, but keep going for
just to say that what I guess we would like in the humanitarian community is we would like to see the media going beyond the sort of stereotypes of aid agency as angels, and beyond the kind of now as potential demons, to being kind of really as we were saying, a more nuanced, thoughtful reporting. And it's not just a question of fundraising, because that's not what's needed. In a lot of these crises, the kind of important role for communication and mass public involvement is really pressure on policies, because that's where the big change can happen. And it's not so simple as just big crisis, send your money.
Okay, there's a comment in the front.
Hi, my name is Scott Bollinger, and I will have to agree with that guy said, but I worked in a number of positions in Afghanistan, one for the Afghanistan Geosafety Office, also for Integrity Watch Afghanistan. So I've gotten a kind of bird's eye perspective of a lot of these, and just what I've seen in regards to all this on the NGO side is definitely this angel sense that is in the media, but it's also coming from the NGOs themselves, and the idea that NGOs should be political organizations. They are politically active. They have a political role to play. And that's fine. That's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. So NGOs getting used to that. There's a lot of dogmatism in the humanitarian space. And from the media side, I don't know the people that are following these things closely are actually getting their news from telly. They're getting their news from ProPublica. They're getting it from globalist.org. There's a lot more information that's possible. And no, I just don't know that television is the right format for it. You know, it has to be concise. So I would see those journalists show a lot of interest, and I was in the position to kind of, point out a few good stories here or there, something beyond Homeland and whatnot. But they wouldn't have time, right? And there were editorial choices and bigger systemic issues that fed into that and that made a lot of sense. But you would see a lot of these small journalists really making their name and making their career based on going out, finding the random thing from the random agency that nobody had heard about. And who knows, maybe they'll end up working for one of the bigger networks someday. So, those are more just observations. I don't have a
Okay, thank you. There's someone in the middle here. Yeah, right at the back.
Hello, I'm Rachel Baird from Christian Aid. I should declare my interest. I work with Andrew. I was a tabloid journalist for a long time, but I've worked at Christian Aid for 3 years in the media team. And I have to say, I absolutely don't recognise the idea that Christian Aid practical programmes respond in any way to what the media team want. We merely tell journalists about what those practical programmes are doing. The other point I'd like to make is just that I think as a former journalist, I feel very strongly that NGOs need to accept that the media have ultimately to think about what's going to interest their audiences, what's going to get readership, what's going to sell newspapers. That is just a fact. And it's
do you
it's
think
pointless.
The aid agencies are part of the problem then? Should the aid agencies be standing up to the media? I mean, it's...
No, we don't have any case. Well, the media have to sell papers and get viewers. And we have to recognise that as their bottom line.
It's not as simple as that. If you actually take the 10 o'clock news, IBT did some research on news output, and we found actually that the 10 o'clock news had more as a proportion of foreign news than any other news programme on ITV or on Sky. So the BBC is taking a deliberate decision to put international content into the 10 o'clock news.
Yeah, but there's no bottom line for us in the same way that there is for people selling newspapers. I'm not, defending. I mean, that's what I was trying to say. We have a responsibility because we take public money to do this, but other people don't. They have to make money. So.
And you can't completely ignore what viewers and listeners want.
Well, we can't ignore what viewers and listeners want either.
How
of
do
course.
you know what they want all the time? Some things we don't know what. How can you know what your audience wants? We don't always. I don't know that I like cheese until I've eaten cheese. I mean, this is absurd.
So let's hear from Katie, who also works for an aid agency.
So I'm Katie Harrison from Tier Fund, and just wanted to come back to one of the things that Rachel just said at the beginning of her comment about the role of a media team within an NGO, and I'm really interested that so many people have this evening assumed that the purpose of a media team is to support fundraising, because that's not my experience actually, and I think in the last few years most UK NGOs have moved their media teams, if they weren't already, into the advocacy department, because it is about bringing about change by helping people to understand the issues and to debate them. So I'd just like to make that point rather than have everyone labour under the assumption that we're all out to make money for the NGO, because that's not the case.
Well said. Anyone else from an NGO? We'll come back to you in a minute, Kitty, who wants to... Because actually the NGOs are getting quite a lot of criticism tonight.
Hi, I'm Tennille. I work for one of the bigger NGOs. Just had a question.
Yeah.
Quite interested in.
You're not going to get away with that. Which NGO do you
I work for World Vision, and
World
I have
Vision,
a question for people who work in media, used to myself. Do you think you need NGOs to do your job?
All right,
because I'm often making the case for you guys to my
we'll come
teams.
back to you in a second. Kitty,
okay.
Anyone else from the audience? Kitty here in the middle, then the guy over there. Is there
Just to follow up on this discussion, I think there's a point that we're perhaps passing over here, which is,
over there.
I think definitely for a TV audience, which I look towards.
Can you speak up? Put your mic on your...
on your mouth.
It's not necessarily the story that attracts the audience. It's how the story is told and how it's presented and how it's shot and what engages the audience. I can't tell you how many hundreds of times I've been out with NGOs who, with the best will in the world, sometimes have quite an academic perspective. They're up to their eyeballs in reports. They love to give you briefings. They're used to VIP visits. And I'm TV. I want to shoot pictures. I want to hear human stories. I want to meet people and listen to case studies. I don't want it to be taken to 20 different places to see all the clever things that the NGO can do all in one day, because that doesn't help me film. It doesn't help me bring the story together. What I want to do is meet real people who can tell moving stories and engage an audience through that way. And I think then sometimes it's not the subject matter that really takes over the issue. It's actually the person who tells that story and whether that person actually engages the viewer. And I think sometimes the NGOs get so bogged down in their issues that they forget actually the individuals and the people who they're helping. And that, for me, as a TV person, is what I want to see when I go to the field, is that person who represents that issue, who can actually communicate it to an audience. And that goes beyond anything else for me.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. There has been a huge cultural change. I mean, I worked at IBT for 10 years now, and when I first came, I think there was a lot of NGOs. Someone talked about, you read a kind of worthy a press release or something, which you would have found a lot of. My impression is there's not much of that NGOs are much sharper and wiser, and they have a lot of people like Andrew working for them who are ex-journalists or ex-producers. So maybe we can hear from some of them, but let's take another comment.
Hi, my name's Lucas Fear-Siegel. I work in the Human Rights Department of a law firm which absolutely agrees that broadcasters, and especially the BBC, often have no idea what their audience figures want. And I refer to the recent Miriam O'Reilly case. But what I wanted to do here is step into the kind of growing brouhaha between media and NGOs, because I think so far in our discussions we've been sort of conglomerating and deeming synonymous NGOs, the aid and development. And I think some distinctions need to be made between the three of them, because I don't think they're in any way synonymous, and I think we need to make a greater distinction between the three.
Great, it's good to have a lawyer in the house. Yeah, comment here. We'll come back to the panel in a minute.
Hi, I don't know if this is a good or bad thing to admit, but I run the media team at UNICEF in the UK. And I just wanted to ask a couple of questions really about some of the contradictions, because we are mostly ex-journalists who worked in the media and we feel all these dilemmas, but at the same time we are, the person that said it's not as simple as it's a big crisis, send us your money. The fact is, if you're an NGO and something like Haiti or Pakistan happens, it is as simple as there's a big crisis, send us your money, because we're trying to deliver resources to those people. And I'm happy to have more of a conversation about that, but it's pretty straightforward when a crisis happens, although obviously not all in other development issues. My questions are twofold really. Firstly, about a bit like the World Vision lady about whether you need NGOs. We have a lot of challenges about the kind of expectation from the media that they want to be totally independent, they don't want to guarantee us any kind of mention or any inclusion of our spokespeople, which is all very well and good, but they also demand a massive amount of facilitation in the field. And actually a lot of my job in the media team is trying to convince our colleagues who are working in programmes in the field that they want to take 2 days out to drive somebody around, deliver vehicles, introduce them to people and facilitate a full itinerary for them. And so that it's a question really about how, in my shoes, you would balance that with the kind of lack of expectation that we're going to even have any mention in the piece, let alone anything else. And also around the budget question, I just wanted to ask a specific question about where you all stand about, and I think I know the answer, but it's a real challenge about paid for trips from NGOs, because unbelievably at UNICEF we never, as probably most of the NGOs, would pay to take a journalist somewhere, but unbelievably we get asked more and more and more if we will cover the cost of the trip. And for me that seems like the most obvious kind of delve into impartiality. So I just wanted people's opinions on that, beyond the BBC, because obviously the BBC is different in that.
But I mean, you're asking questions, but what's your own perspective when you're dealing with the media? Do you, as Andrew said, do you get a fair and just response? Do you feel that they take the idea or the story seriously and you get a fair shout.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have, well, you know, as I'm sure most of the other press officers here, we have honest, you know, well-established relationships with the press, but I think it is too simple. You know, you're kind of simplifying it too much to say press officers are trying to spin the story, because absolutely we want to facilitate for the journalist, but I also want to have an honest conversation with the journalist to say, listen, you know, I do have a goal, which is either to get my message across or to educate your listeners about what UNICEF does or to raise money. And I need to kind of make sure that the effort that we're going to put in, quite understandably, to deliver that piece, and that's what we're there for. We're there as facilitators a lot of the time. But I also need to be able to have that honest conversation about what the outcome is going to be and how that benefits us, and I'd expect a journalist to understand that. And most of the time, in my experience, they do, but I just wanted to...
Okay, let's just pick up that point, Fran. I mean, this does come up a lot, that you ask for a lot and you don't give much in return. Credits, name checks.
Well, that's interesting about the points that have been made about photojournalism, and from Benjamin too. I don't really have a problem with aid agencies providing picture galleries on the BBC News website, as long as they're labelled. And as long as we say who they are, and hopefully we do say pictures courtesy of whoever. And that actually applies to some extent to using video news releases as well. You know, we don't want to do it, but we will do it, and we are, I hope, well, the policy certainly is to be pretty strict about labelling. So we would want to do that, to be transparent with the audience. Well, then that's the main reason, to be honest, rather than give credit to the people who've shot it. But really, we want to be able to say, you know, we haven't shot this ourselves, so therefore we've not been in control of it editorially. So I don't really sort of recognise the kind of not giving credit stuff, but you know, there is this symbiotic relationship here, which is we rely on NGOs and charities to actually tell us about things that are happening. You know, this is you know, we are generalists. I'm not a specialist in this area. I don't know what's happening on. You know, hopefully you will tell us and give us stories and bring us stories, and that's kind of what you do. And we're there we do employ specialists who can, in this field, who then can assess it. But in general, most of this stuff is done by people who are not expert in their area, the same as in any other subject that we cover. So, you know, I think that just to pick up on the, you know, we don't know what the audience... I think there's some... You know, you saying, how do you know what your audience are interested in? I think the audience have the potential to be interested in anything, as long as it's well told. Absolutely any subject whatsoever you can interest in an audience in, if they are given a reason as to why they should be interested in it, which sometimes is quite difficult, actually. You know, you have to sometimes, you know, and news bulletins are news. You know, it's the 8 most important things that have happened in the world that day. So, you know, you can't flam these things up. There has to be decent, proper pegs for them. And as, you know, we don't know what our audiences want. Well, you know, we do a bit of research, actually, and we also have a direct relationship with our audience, too. You know, they email us and they phone our programmes and they take part in our output. So we actually do have a pretty good idea about what it is that they're interested in, although they often surprise us too. Daily, I would say, they surprise us.
Andrew?
I think the bit I'd like to pick up is this question of complicated issues. Do people want to know about complicated issues? One of the big problems we face at Christian Aid is this. Poverty is political. It's not party political, but in the year 2011, the fact that people are living in the world in hugely disadvantaged and deprived conditions is the result of disempowerment. It's the result of choices made by governments, choices made by institutions, choices made by communities. And when you try to tell that story, it's more than a story. When you try to present that reality, you are automatically being seen as suspect being seen as in somehow anti-capitalist or anti-business. This is one of the problems we face with our tax campaign. Our tax campaign, we are accused, because we are saying that big business routinely deprives poor countries of badly needed tax revenues. We're told we're anti-business. That isn't true. We're actually pro-business. What we are trying to do is to ensure that those companies that don't indulge in that kind of malpractice are on an even playing field. And this is, you know, I've listened to what various people have said about, you know, do we know what audiences want, or do we simply give them what we think that they need? And speaking as somebody now firmly embedded in the NGO camp, but with a professional journalist background, you know, there is such a thing as news sense that one has to accept exists. And the bit I read out earlier about the small community in Angola, you're absolutely right. You can make anything interesting. It's the way you tell it. And that's what I was trying to illustrate. It is, how do you tell the story of a small community like that? Well, you have to maximise the issues that are involved. That takes time, that takes resources, and what makes that community any more important than another? Everything's to do with choices. All we can say is that we do our best to ensure that the issues that we're concerned about get aired publicly. And it is somewhat disheartening, and this is absolutely no criticism of the very valuable member of the Christian Aid staff whose job it is to liaise with celebrities, but we got hugely more publicity by taking the actor Nick Holt to Kenya to look at the impact of climate change than we have for virtually anything else we've said about climate change. We got a great deal more publicity by taking the model Lily Cole to the Burma-Thai border to talk about the plight of the refugees there than we would have done if we'd put out a very worthy but nonetheless non-newsy, working to the agenda that exists out there, not the agenda that we've created. So we are basically, we have to use the tools at our disposal. We have to maximise our impact by using the tools that the media present us with.
Okay.
Ben?
Yeah, I think storytelling becomes much more complex when you have conflicting interests. And that's what we're hearing. Telling stories, yeah, but we want to get our name on this. Okay? So think about it this way. What are NGOs supposed to do? Is one of their functions to tell the stories of their beneficiaries or to give them a voice? If giving them a voice, why is that not enough? Why do you have to have UNICEF name on that? Why can't you facilitate them to have a voice and think, well, that's money well spent, that we've actually given those people a voice? Because actually, if you look at the Convention of Human Rights, our right is not for people to speak for us, it's for people to have a voice. So I think we need to remember, why is it that we are in this industry, if we're in this aid industry? What is it that we're trying to achieve? And trying to simplify some of those conflicting interests to make it a little bit easier to tell those stories, which maybe will help us understand it's a more complex world than previously some of what we're given presumes.
There was a reference earlier to soap operas, and I remember we used to sit around at DFID talking about this, about, God, imagine if we could get Kat Slater and Alfie Moon talking about fiduciary risk in budget support operations. Very sad. And I think there is a question about how is there actually a mass audience for the complexities of development, and I think there isn't. It is a complex subject, and I think Fran's right, to the BBC. I think the BBC does push a lot of content out there about development as much as is possible. I think also credit to the way that reporting has changed over the last 10 years. I think it was work you were involved with, Mark, that about 10 years ago that was looking at how a development story is told, focusing more on the human stories rather than the complex geopolitics. And I think that has had a change in telling some of the stories. But we have to accept that what's going on in Ghana today is not really likely to get into the top 10 news. So I think there are two issues. One is, I do worry in terms of the humanitarian emergencies, how they're reported still. I remember I was running the communications department at DFID during the tsunami, and we had two very key principles. One was not to go around committing money until we knew what the needs were. And we got so much criticism because the DEC, the NGOs were all out there raising money, and we weren't pledging anything. We weren't pledging anything because we didn't know what we were pledging for. And I think trying to push, the way we were pushed into sort of trying to pledge sums of money and throw money at the problem, I think wasn't particularly helpful. And I think the other one that always goes with humanitarian emergencies is people still giving products. I wish we could really help the public to just give money. You know, it's just pointless. I mean, we had a hanger full of, odds and ends, which people had given generously. Yeah, people have been enormously generous in response to the tsunami, to the Pakistan earthquake, but actually their generosity was wasted because someone, and I'm not talking about the main NGOs or the DEC here, but some organisations weren't helping people to channel their generosity in the right ways. And I think helping people in that way to make those informed choices so their generosity can make a difference is really important. The other thing I'd say, I think, is in terms of the quality of the debate in the UK, I think, suffers from the fact it's so undiverse. In a sense, we've got three narratives. We've got one narrative is aid is good, we should have more of it. A second one is some scepticism around the role of business, and then occasionally a small narrative around the things the government does wrong. But actually, in terms of genuine disagreements about policy issues, there's very little about that. And I think that the gentleman here was talking about the disarmament and global peace. I think one of the great contributions the Centre for Global Development in the US has done is creating its index of rich countries' contribution to development, where the UK actually scores quite low because of the size of the arms industry. So intelligent products have actually helped that debate. And I do feel that our kind of think tank and NGO community is not really enriching the debate. And I hope there's someone here from a conservative think tank. You've got to start a programme on international development so we actually have a debate about this, rather than it all just being one direction.
Well, the 10 o'clock news tonight is running a piece which Humphrey Hawksley has done from, I think it was Uganda, which is, I think, a World Food Programme project, which is about withdrawal of aid and trying to reduce dependency on aid, which I would say is actually kind of quite an important contribution to this whole debate. And, also you have to sort of say, China, well, whenever I go and meet the Chinese about how they won't give us any visas to get in there, and they say, you keep banging on about human rights all the time, don't you understand that we have taken hundreds of thousands of Chinese out of poverty through trade? Well, it's a fair point, isn't it? And it's sort of that kind of aspect of development is often forgotten.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. Yeah, can we have people who haven't spoken yet?
Thanks very much. My name is Sharon Harvey. I'm here in my personal capacity this evening, but I do work for the Department for International Development. Two related questions, and they're all about balance, or they're both about balance. And the first question is, how do we strike a balance on the BBC and on the 10 o'clock news between reporting on the Australian floods and 12 people who have lost their lives there, and then an afterthought, and that package might run for a good 7, perhaps 8 minutes, and then a very short package that might run for 30 seconds. Oh, and by the way, 500 people have lost their lives in mudslides in Brazil. Now, I take as given that that was breaking news on Brazil that evening, so that was just incidental perhaps, but how do we strike that balance? And how do we avoid that sort of bias in reporting on humanitarian disasters? That's my first question. And my second one is then around balance, around reporting on conflict, corruption, chaos, confusion, despair, and the most extraordinary stories that bring hope and optimism about what does happen when development works, essentially, and the wonderful things that people do to transform their own lives. How do we report on that too? It might not be breaking news, but how do we strike that balance? Because I rather fear that focusing on the former rather than the latter is what turns people off and perhaps reduces the interest that they have in international development.
Yeah, that's interesting. Magda, and then there was someone else over there. Yeah.
My name is Magda Walter, and I think I probably straddle
the two worlds, as do a number of people here, in the sense that I worked as a journalist for about 20 years. And I also worked as a media PR person in several aid agencies, and also as a consultant in recent years for a number of large NGOs and on their media strategies and so forth. One of the things that even comes out of this discussion is something that I've observed many times on the inside of various NGOs, is that they don't always really know why they want to communicate with the public, with the outside world. They're not very strategic about it. So we've heard various objectives. We've heard about fundraising. We've heard about generating debate or taking that debate forward and contributing to it. We've talked about getting a mention, which is just basically getting visibility for the organization in question. And when it's about visibility, to what purpose do we want to raise the visibility? Again, is it for raising funds or for having a voice at the table or what? So I think that if a number, and I used to work at the World Bank for a while, and a lot of people here probably don't like the World Bank very much. But one of the most interesting things I learned there was the art of strategic communications, where you actually know who you're talking to and how you talk to them, and what tools you deploy depending on who you're talking to and what your objective is as an agency, not as a journalist. I'm speaking now. And by knowing those things and having a well-calibrated communication strategy, you can always talk to the people you want, through the media you want, through the channels you want, with the stories that suit the audience and suit your objective. I think that's a very important thing that organizations don't really know.
Okay. Someone has the mic. Yep. Okay. Any more hands? We're wrapping up, so a couple more questions, if anyone. Yeah. Yeah. Go on. The mic over here at the front. You go. Yeah.
My name's Tabitha. I work for Christian Aid as well, although not in the media team. I'd just like to say something about name checks, which I think you brought up and has been mentioned in the audience as well. Of course, bringing the voices of the disempowered, of the powerless, into the media is an end in itself, and I don't think any NGO would disagree with that. But as I understand it, name checks are important for at least 3 reasons. Firstly, you've brought that voice there, but if you want to bring it there next year, then you need to fundraise. So you need to bring money in so that you can continue promoting those voices in forums where they wouldn't otherwise be heard. Secondly, you want to bring the voice of whoever it is, the Palestinian refugee in Lebanon, but you also want the member of the public who's watching the television to go to your website and download the letter that they can send to their MP, so that it becomes an issue here and people are getting engaged in campaigns and advocacy. And thirdly, I think it's about an ongoing engagement. So it's not just the give £2 or send this email. It's, this is an issue that you can become involved in a long-term sense. And we've talked a bit about a tax campaign. It's difficult to get people engaged in tax, but once they start realising that this is a long-term issue that any organisation is working on and they can get involved in it, then they're going to become more engaged, more sensitive, more passionate about that issue. And unless you're getting the story out there, but also getting the same messages out there, you're not going to do that. I also had one quick question, which is I've heard lots of different conflicting sort of throwaways or opinions or questions about whose responsibility it is to educate the UK public about how much aid we should be giving or the problem of global poverty. And I'd just like to bounce it back to the panel. Is that the NGOs or is that the media or is that both? And if it's both, then brilliant.
Okay, thanks. 2 questions here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Megan Novak. I'm a student at Regents College working on my master's degree in media communications, so I'm probably bridging the gap between almost in the profession and still an audience member. And I've heard a lot tonight about the obvious intricacies involved in reporting long-term conflict, complex crises, but when you have the big picture stories, the large-scale humanitarian crises, there's an obvious schism between the way Haiti was reported and the floods in Pakistan. Why are so many members of the general public under the assumption that Haiti was a much larger scale humanitarian crisis than the floods in Pakistan. When you have program directors who have been working for NGOs for decades saying that Pakistan is the worst humanitarian crisis they have ever seen. There's been some research.
Okay, person next to you.
Catherine Tollington. Excuse me. I work on business development with NGOs. I think one thing we should recognise in terms of NGOs getting their name out there and what they're doing is that it's an extremely competitive environment now, and all the NGOs that I work with are competing with each other for funding, and so unfortunately there's a sort of reluctance in some areas to collaborate on getting a story out. And so the person's point over there about all these different NGOs trying to get their story out first is a real issue. And I think there's perhaps a further debate on NGO marketing, which is inextricably linked, I think, to the aid issue and the response to disaster issue.
Thank you. Okay. We'll just take concluding remarks from the members of the panel. I'd like to just pick up this question about news values. IBT's produced a recent report called Global Generation. I've got some copies if anyone wants a copy. This explores with young people what interests them about what's happening in the wider world. And we found that the media is the way that engages them, but the stereotypes and the ways in which the media report the developing world puts them off. So we heard the question here, which is the same sort of question in a way. Should you be doing more on the Australian floods or on the mudslides in Brazil? Should you be doing more on corruption, or should you be doing more on something positive? And we've heard from several people, Andrew included, that news is news. There are certain immutable news values. And it is a cause of frustration that you can't tinker with those values. So
I think that the question from the audience about Australia versus Brazil is a really, really interesting one, which we asked ourselves, and we sat at the morning meeting that morning after the Brazilian mudslide has happened, and we said, oh my God, we've just done 4 days on Australia, we mustn't, forget what's happened here. But you could say, couldn't you, why are you covering, why is it Australia versus Brazil? Why is it not the reforms of the National Health Service versus Brazil? You've decided to set them in some kind of, we can't deal with more than one sort of disaster that's happening to people at any one time. It's a kind of false parallel, this is. This is about, the question really is, what amount of time and effort should we be putting into this particular story? So I think the question is, should we have put more effort into the Brazilian mudslide rather than, should it have had more than the Australian floods?
And what's the answer?
Possibly yes, and I think it could have been quite interesting, but this is when the realities of running a news operation come into play, which are around, where is this place? Do we have a correspondent and a bureau anywhere nearby? How much is it going to cost us to get there? What is my budget looking like this month? Pretty overspent, actually. How much do the audience have an interest in this, that they will be demanding us to cover it? All those questions come into play when you actually, make the judgments about what to commit your resources to or not. And obviously, we don't always get it right. We don't always get it right. But, it's a judgment on the day. I would also sort of say, and I'm not trying to be defensive about this, because I think it's a fascinating question that you ask about news values, but this did get the Brazilian mudslide, 2 nights running on the 10 o'clock news. So, it was covered. I think the wider issues around it even got covered as well, which is, you know, why has this happened? Is it deforestation? Is it? So there was an attempt actually around that story to go into some of that. But I suppose that, you know, you could say, well, this is what you're interested in, this is what I'm less interested in, Australian floods. We have to make a judgment about what we think is important for the audience to know about. I'm rambling now, but basically I'm saying it's complex and we don't always get it right.
Okay, Andrew, Australian floods or Brazilian mudslides?
I think that the reality is this, that you are going to get, I hate to have to say this, but you are going to get more audience reaction about stories that they themselves can identify with than stories a long way away in a part of the world in which Britain historically has had very little interest.
Okay, Ben?
I think that that's just basically news.
You're shaking your head.
Well, I just think, you know, we're all human. When I went to Ethiopia to live there, I thought, well, where is Ethiopia? Because the place I went to live in was nothing like I'd seen. And the people living there were like me. They're worried about education, they're worried about food, they're worried about their kids. So this divide, where is it created? Because in reality it doesn't really exist. And that's very troubling. That comment is very, very troubling, and it says something.
Well, what it says is there are news realities.
Yeah,
To tell people stories as human beings. They're not aliens.
Well,
I find it slightly offensive to be accused of suggesting that they are aliens. What I am saying...
There was a difference, wasn't there?
No, I didn't say there was a difference. You've just said there was a difference. I said that there is a difference in what the audience is going to respond to.
Why? What audience? Why?
I want to let Mike have a comment, because clearly this is the subject to discuss in a drink downstairs. But quick word from Mike, and then...
Like a shark has to swim to stay alive, NGOs have to communicate to propagate their brands. People judge NGOs on the basis of the brands and not on any evidence of their impact. Absolutely. That's one of the big problems we have. So I had a concrete suggestion, which was that the UK government provides about £350 million a year of taxpayers' money to the aid NGOs. And the idea I suggested was that actually DFID should rate them. They should rate the quality of the NGO's humanitarian programmes, their development programmes, and their policy programmes. Because DFID has a huge amount of expertise in these, it's a customer, and it could provide that information as 5-star rankings to improve the public debate and actually help the public to make those choices. I got vetoed on that one.
What happens when we
But I think it's coming. I think it's...
Go ahead.
DFID is actively seeking views from the public at large about how NGOs are performing and how aid is being distributed. So I think it's probably a battle you won without realising.
Start with DFID though, eh?
Yep, start with DFID.
Absolutely right. There is a consultation as we speak on how UK money is spent on aid. Well, listen, thank you very much. It's been lively. I'm not sure we've actually come to any conclusions, but Brazilian mudslides or Australian floods, that's your topic for tonight. Thank you very much.